So welcome this Master Talk session on the building MA and technical process, led by myself, Mark Laws. I'm out of Keystone and Rocky Mountains. If you attended the earlier ones with Chris, this new format this year is that we record the first session of the month and the first session of the topic for that month. And then we move through so that that can be shown on the YouTube channel later on. So I'm going to invite you all to stay muted and use the chat to post any questions that may come up in this little presentation. And we'll try to save a few minutes at the end of this to address those questions. Then obviously we'll be moving into the next week is the clarification session that I will also be leading. And we'll be then moving into practice and application, much like Chris did in June and the other guys. So as I said, the format is that 4 weekly master talk, clarification, practice, and application. And then on top of that, we have 5 Tuesdays in July and September. So the 5th Tuesday will actually be an additional wild card multi-discipline presentation. And I believe the 5th Tuesday this month, we have Mike Ma presenting a multi-discipline presentation on that 5th Tuesday. So as I said, we've got the clinic attendance posted there. Hopefully we can all see that now. And then you also down there have the direct link to Chris's master talk on technical foundations, from which I plan to build beyond that in terms of building MA and technical process. Below that is the Vail Ski and Ride School YouTube page, which then has access to all the other trainings, just like Alpine, Kids, Adaptive. It's all posted on there as well. All right, I am going to share my PowerPoint that I've brought up here, so keep me on track. All right, can we all see that Vail Resort Ski Snowboard School summer training? Good. All right, so as we go on through this little section here, as I said, we're going to focus on building on those technical foundations, building up our MA and technical process. As we go through, again, just repeating that little format of our master talk recorded here, our clarification next week, followed by practice and application. So you got that link there. It's important to get that registration in as we grow this program, and I'm grateful to be able to join this now and present to you with the rest of the crew. But as we grow this, it's now sponsored by 16 different resorts. Started off by Vail itself, and is growing bigger and bigger as we go along. So if we get more and more attendance, it just shows that we are getting good response and budget and getting more people involved. Okay, the clinicians or the clinic leaders for these sessions currently are going to be myself, Vail's Chris Rogers and Lindsay Stevens, Beaver Creek's Sam Reichstein, Breckenridge's Jesse Yedwab, Jazz Gilbert, and Noah Hopkins, who's doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes organization. And all of these topics over the next few months are obviously delving into our learning connection model. Obviously, we're still in the technical skills area here, but some of this student overlap, some of this people skills overlap is going to come about when we're getting into prescriptions or when you're talking about your personal performance in your personal analysis section. So we're going to continue and develop on from the technical skills triangle and the master talk that Chris gave before. I did watch it so I could plan my my talk here. And obviously we are talking as trainers with what we present each week to keep the content building on previous sessions. And if you didn't or weren't able to attend some of those, as I said, that Chris Rogers' Master Talk is available on that YouTube channel. So my big thing here, and as I get into building process now, is I do honestly feel as a trainer, it's not my job to train you guys what I see. It's more presenting some ideas, some concepts, maybe some common threads that we experience, and to taking those ideas, taking those processes to develop your process for developing your MA and your technical understanding, because I can't train you to process what I saw. I can only help you on the journey of processing what you saw. And so for that reason, we might actually use some of the similar images from Chris's talk so that you see that different instructors see different things, explain it a little differently, but it's still covered by the biomechanics and the movement analysis, um, the technical understanding piece that we would adhere to with those technical foundations, those 6 fundamentals that Chris presented in the first Master Talk. So as we go into this, we can start thinking about our observational styles, if you wish. And I want to recognize that we all perhaps see different things when we watch a piece of video or watch a rider. Obviously, we can see some, movements and work at what that's doing to the snowboard. So these are all the classic things that we do all the time. We can see maybe the board does something on the ground, catches an edge or whatever, and then we work out what the body did to that to make that happen. Or we could be looking at the balance, the core, and working out what's happening with the body above that and what's happening to the board below that core. So this is all from our technical manuals. It's all the idea of what you can observe in your process of analyzing the movements of the body and what it's doing to the board, or what the board is doing and what the movements were to create that. And as we get into a little bit of this, I want you to recognize your natural style of what you see, develop that first, and then start practicing when you're watching videos and we get into the other sessions, start using and practicing the other styles, even if it's not as natural to you. So obviously the end result is to develop MA process and technical understanding. It might be for an exam, which is why I'm going to just go through a little bit of our assessment forms here. Obviously, a lot of it could be for your personal development, your lessons and so forth. But some of these aspects in our assessment form are going to be important. So as we obviously look at movement analysis, we have our OEP model, our observe and describe, or our evaluation of the rider's movements and the board performance, and then our prescription of how we're going to change that. That is consistent on all the assessment forms as we go through all different sets. Our technical understanding is very similar because, as you can see, it's not worded in the same way because it's not you watching somebody else. The big part of this is assessed on that personal performance piece that we do in our assessments. But you can see how it's still understanding the biomechanics and physics. Okay? It's which is obviously the same in our movement analysis of the movements. It's what the body does to control the snowboard. Then it's the fundamentals to personal performance. This is that one big piece where we have to do assessment activities on personal analysis, and because it's about what we are doing, our personal performance. And then obviously it comes into that technical understanding of the tactics, the equipment. Again, this is where the snowboard comes in, the snow surface, the environment, the starts we have, the physical interactions that we personally have with our equipment and the environment around us. And as I just go to the next slide where we get Cert 2, this is all Cert 1 on the screen right now. And you most importantly can see it's one or more technical fundamentals. So it's basically focusing on one or more of our snowboard fundamentals. And then now as we go look at Cert 2 and Cert 3 here, obviously everyone's signing in as, at different levels of their journey, I'm sure. And as we progress through this, as our technical foundations was focused on, was a really good understanding of each individual fundamental. In this little session, we're going to start delving into more, and hopefully did a little bit of this in the technical foundations practice and application. We're going to delve into a little bit more of how they interact, how they influence each other, and more importantly, how we start to analyze and we can keep them separate before we get too confused combining them together. Because as you can see here, our Cert 2 requirements become, again, it's still the OEP model for movement analysis and the biomechanics and personal performance and tactics and equipment for technical understanding. But the biggest change you can see here is how Cert 2 becomes 2 or more technical fundamentals, and Cert 3 becomes 3 or more technical fundamentals. Okay? But otherwise, the assessment is pretty similar. Okay, so some other tools that were in our technical foundations that really help us with movement analysis is our reference alignments, which I'm just wanted to refresh and review from before, because this is where we get into some of our early problems or tendencies to perhaps describe these positions or describe how someone is in or out. And it becomes very easy to fall into that trap where you end up describing positions rather than movement. And it is all about movement analysis and the technical understanding of how movement controls the snowboard. But we want to be aware of these reference alignments because we can think of them as mid positions, the midline, that helps us describe the movement in and out of reference alignment, as opposed to how the rider is riding in a position as we go through the next little part of our session here. So here we got a little picture of Chris Rogers as we start off thinking about those reference alignments. And as I said, we are going to use some of the very similar pictures that he had. This was his little sign-off card with himself on it. But obviously here we can say, in terms of those reference alignments, okay, yep, if I'm describing a position, I can see that his shoulders are a little open towards the nose of the snowboard. He's not in that reference alignment where his upper body is perfectly perpendicular to the front foot. He's definitely open to the snowboard. I might be already addressing some rotational movement, some idea of getting into some pivot. But it's very hard to describe that when I'm describing a position rather than the movement he might have made to get there. I look at this rider as well and I think, okay, well, is he, between the feet and maybe aligned with his weight over the heel side edge because he's in a heel side turn? He might be a little bit out of that reference alignment, but again, because I'm thinking about reference alignments, it's very easy to fall into that trap of describing the position rather than the movement in or out. And that part of the reason I wanted to pick a still image to start this session off, to really think about how, yeah, it's really easy to fall in that trap. And I look at his legs, maybe his back leg is a little bit more flexed than his front leg. His back leg might be a tiny little bit shorter. His hips are dropping back. Already I'm starting to think about fore and aft, and that his weight isn't between his feet for that reference alignment. If I start thinking about that reference alignment in terms of the terrain, he's reaching for the snow, doing that hillside Euro, getting the hand on the ground. His shoulders are definitely dipping, so I can't necessarily say that his shoulders and his hips are necessarily perfectly perpendicular to the terrain. But again, falling into that little trap of talking about positions rather than movements. So just a little slide just to remind ourselves that we want to take that skill. We don't want to throw that away if we saw that position. But what we want to do instead is start training ourselves in the process of Instead of that, maybe I can describe how I move from one position to the other, and then I'm back into talking about movement analysis rather than position analysis. So if someone is out of a reference alignment, how did they move to get out of that reference alignment? How did they move through that reference alignment? So did Chris start off with his upper body perpendicular to that front foot? And as he went into the control phase of that hillside turn, did he turn his upper body? And then we're describing movement. So we finish off with this little line here with, we can start thinking about that if we see positions, perhaps in the initiation, perhaps in the control, perhaps in the finish of a turn, we can describe how that rider moves from one position to the next position in the next phase of the turn, and then already we've got description of movement. And I see some of you taking notes. Do bear in mind that you will also be able to go back and watch this recording and take screenshots and so forth. So don't worry if you feel you've missed anything, and we'll hopefully have a couple of minutes to clarify anything here if you need it. So moving into the turn phases in ATML, I know that Chris presented that this is a big contention on big topic of conversation of when does the next turn start. And as long as at this point you can describe the movements and what happens to the snowboard and you put it in the phase of your choice, that is where your technical understanding comes in and whether you can back up why you do that. Whether it's the initiation, control, and finish, I personally, and this is something that you can take away and hopefully use yourself, look at the direction change. So if you look at our first little initiation, control, finish diagram here on the left, obviously we've got initiation where we're getting, whether you're looking at the track of the snow or the board performance, the board has perhaps flattened and is starting to move down the fall line. The direction has changed from the finish of the turn before, moving down the hill. So I think that something happened here. The rider moved, created some snowboard fundamentals, some snowboard performance to start the next turn. Obviously, as we describe and go through our MA, when we get into some video and start describing different actual tasks, whether it's a carve turn or a skidded turn, that control phase is going to be different. It might be longer, it might be shorter, but that's where that comes into our movement analysis. And then again, finish of the turn, I think ends when the next initiation of the turn and the direction change again occurs as we move in the next turn down the hill. That is just the way I like to look at it at this point in time. And if that helps you be able to describe your turn phases, then feel free to use it. Same thing with ATML. If you look at the way we think of a jump or a ramp for a rail feature, again, we can kind of attribute a direction change as to being that point where something has happened between phases of ATML. Whether it's approach into the transition for the takeoff, there's a direction change. As we leave the lip of the takeoff and enter the rail feature or the jump, there's a direction change where the maneuver is going to happen. And then as we come down to the landing, there's going to be some direction change in terms of the board reaching the snow and then going down the landing zone. So again, I just like my way of simplifying it myself. You are going to choose what parts of this process development is going to work for you. So in the rest of this session, in terms of that analysis, we're going to really focus on the how, the which, the where, the when, what, why, and who. A lot of W's, the big how there, but I felt that whether you're teaching or whether you're doing movement analysis, if you can cover these categories, they are going to leave you with no doubt that you've covered everything. These are the same exact and when we finally get to teaching theory and teaching skills later on down the line, these are the same open questions that we ask when we're teaching, because you can't give a yes or no answer to it. So when you're developing your technical understanding and you're movement analysis process, if we're thinking about these words, and we're going to go through in more depth of how we can use them, you're not going to miss anything. But before I leave this little section, again, this is one of the common traps we fall into as we're developing our process, is we might describe what happened rather than how we moved or how we made that happen. Oh, the rider caught an edge and fell over. Well, that's what happened, but we need to describe how the rider moved that made that happen. So this is why we're going to really focus on these little elements here. Because we can start thinking about our cause and effect relationships. Again, this is straight from building up from the Chris's technical foundations and the other guys that did the practice. But we want to think about the body movements, those fundamental movements that we can have, the flexion, extension, the rotation, are the cause of anything that happens. Those body movements cause the snowboard to do something in our snowboard performance. That is the effect that we are creating. Whether it's inefficient and ineffective and we want to change it, or whether it's amazing and we want to do it again, right? It's a part of our cause and effect relationship. Those two things together are what create our snowboard fundamentals. Okay? And then obviously, finally, the part of our cause and effect relationships is what happens to the task. So someone moves, gets more edge, turns a skidded turn into a carved turn. That would be our task outcome. We changed the task. Okay? So now we want to try to put the how, which, where, when, what, why, and who in there. So again, if we think about those body movements causing things to happen, we want to think about not what is happening, but how is the body moving? Which body parts are moving? Okay, because that will help us describe when someone says, well, he bent his knees. But did the back and the hips move back? Or when that rider bent the knee, did the knee move forward? So where does that body part move? If we get into that point of talking about specific body parts, how they're moving, where they're moving to, suddenly our description is very, very different. So in that still image of Chris before, I could say the rider turned the shoulders using the spine and the hips and turn them towards the nose of the snowboard. So we can say, how is the body moving? Which body parts are moving and where are they moving to? Then we're describing movements rather than positions. And obviously, as you can see there, the way we can really build up that description is by bringing in duration, intensity, and rate. I haven't got to the full dirt yet because timing will come a bit later on, but obviously with how they're moving, which body parts are moving, and where they're moving to, duration, intensity, and rate are going to be a fantastic tool to describe whether it's a super intense, fast rate, but short duration movement, or perhaps it's a slow rate, low intensity, longer duration movement. Again, this is going to help you describe how the body is moving rather than only what just happened. So now we go into timing. When does the body move? All right. And again, hopefully this format of how, which, where, when, what, why, and who is starting to make a lot of sense when we roll through these. So we can start thinking about when the body moves, timing. And as we just saw on the last slide, perhaps the first part to start thinking about that is our turn phases. The rider did this in the initiation of the toe side turn to make this happen. The rider did this in the approach to the rail and was too slow, because of this, right? We can get the timing in there. So now we've got all of dirt already, and we haven't even necessarily got to what the snowboard's doing. So now we're into the what does the snowboard do? What happens to the snowboard? What the snowboard does. Okay? And this is then with those two together is where our fundamentals come about. And as we practice through this, as we clarify next week, we want to take those technical foundations of each individual fundamental. So we're solid with that before we start worrying about trying to describe two or three or more at the same time. That's where we need to build our process so we don't get ourselves confused, muddled up, and maybe we get to that point where fundamentals might influence each other, but we want to think about the movements that created each one, because it's those two, flexion, extension, and rotation body movements, those fundamental movements, that are doing all 6 fundamentals to the snowboard at the same time. And if we're describing it to our student and we're prescribing a change, we want to be clear about which fundamental we're changing first, but we want to have the technical understanding of how they influence each other through those movements. So then obviously we get to that why, why that relationship changes the task. Because, when you're doing MA and you say that, hey, you got really, really skidded at the end of the turn, that's the why. And it makes it nice and easy about then prescribing why you might want to change it. Your toe side turn is super skiddy and your heel side turn is a little more carvy. We want to make them the same. Why? So we can do the same turn in both directions. And then obviously with that prescription that's where that final who comes in. We want to make that prescription or that evaluation of that rider pertinent and relevant to that rider. So it's maybe that's where we're thinking about that who, the people skills, why does that prescription, the exercise plan change? Why is it going to be applicable to that rider? So again, just before you leave this slide, hopefully that made a little sense with thinking about our how, our which, our where, our when, our what, our why, and who. In MA, it makes sure that we're addressing all the things that we might need to analyze, and then it makes it really easy to turn it backwards and present our prescription in the same idea, because when we're teaching, if we present to the open questions and then you ask them are we going to move, well, that's exactly what you observed and exactly how you presented it. So obviously there the who is thinking about those tactics, equipment, and that prescription. All right. So we move on to the next slide. Everyone took a few notes. So we're reviewing those snowboard fundamentals. Obviously, we've got 6 snowboard fundamentals in our ASI format, and all of those fundamentals are occurring all of the time. Whether we're dialing them up and turning them up and having more of them, whether we're turning them down and need less of it. Okay. So we need to develop the understanding of how those body movements control multiple fundamentals at the same time and how they might influence each other. All right. So if we start off with just reviewing these fundamentals, the first ones we're just going nice and easy there are the pressure fundamentals. And to review what Chris was saying in that first foundations, it's about the controlling the relationship of the center of mass to the base of support. It's really easy to think about where it is over and during the turn, but then all of a sudden we might start talking about other fundamentals like tilt when we're thinking about pressure across the width of the board, or perhaps changing pivot points. And before we know, instead of talking about pressure along the length of the snowboard, we're starting to drift off and talk about pivot at the wrong time. So it's controlling the relationship of center of mass to the base of support to direct pressure along the length of the snowboard. It's about control of the relationship of the center of mass to the base of support to direct pressure across the width of the snowboard. And then it's controlling the magnitude of pressure created through snowboard surface interaction. And we can really think about this as the three different planes that the center of mass can move over the snowboard, or that the snowboard can move underneath our center of mass, right? X, Y, Z, we can move along the board, longitudinal. It's the only way I remember it is to think along is like longitudinal. And then the lateral, or the pressure across the width of the snowboard from toe to heel, heel to toe. And then obviously we can move our center of mass closer to the snowboard or further away from the snowboard, or the snowboard further away from us. So think of that center of mass moving vertically over the snowboard. X, Y, Z. And obviously we want to think about that when we're getting through our pressure fundamentals, because again, they can happen all at the same time. So obviously, if you're focusing on one, describe the movements that actually produce that. And we're going to go through some examples of that in a little bit. So we want to consider these three forms of pressure control that we have by adjusting the relationship of the center of mass to the snowboard and not necessarily to the turn. When we're looking at a video, there's other forces in play that direct that center of mass relationship to the snowboard because we're in a turn. And I'm not going to nerd out and get too mathematical with you guys yet. Okay. So then if we add pivot, right, the control of this board's pivot through flexion, extension, and rotation of the body. Like directly out of the text, out of the technical study guide, and out of our national standards. And I'm going to go to the next slide, and I like to think of it as rotation first. And I only say that because it's the same movements, but in my brain, it just makes me a little bit more direct, where I think, okay, if I've got rotation, that is the most efficient way in my mind to control pivot. And so the flexion extension will add to that, but it just helps me kind of focus. If I'm talking about rotational movements, highly likely I'm going to be talking about pivot. And again, it might not work for you. These are just some suggestions. I like to turn it around this way because I feel it just helps me out just that little bit. So I need to go back. Everyone got that one? All right. So adding in tilt. Again, this is in the order that they're presented on our national standards. But it's control of the board's tilt with a combination of inclination and angulation. Lots of big words in there. And then a lot of people get trapped by making sure that they use those words. And if it comes down to, as you develop your process, more importantly, talk about the movements that made the board move onto edge or to flatten. Okay, because essentially what we're thinking about here is inclination is some part of the body, generally, obviously, the core, the body is inclining to the slope to leverage that board onto edge, or it's reducing the inclination to the slope to flatten the board, to reduce that tilt. That is what inclination is. Angulation is using the legs to bend and put angles in the body to control that tilt in the snowboard with the legs and the levers of the shin and of the femur of the leg to do that with less inclination. There has to be some inclination to get the board on edge at all, to some extent, because the only pure example I can think of angulation would be a Michael Jackson on a box, where the body isn't leaning over and that board is on edge. And then obviously the pure inclination is those leaner turns where you are literally not moving anything and just leaning right over to get the board on edge. That's where we're controlling the board's tilt. And again, I'm reviewing these fundamentals because it's very easy to confuse and mix the pressure across the width of the snowboard with our control of tilt. But and feel free to get up and move and try this out. The idea of the difference is if you're standing on your snowboard and you move your body to stand just on the ball of your foot or feet, the toes, but you're not moving so far to actually move the snowboard, that is you perhaps bending your ankles, moving your center of mass over your toes rather than over the middle of the board. You're moving and directing pressure to the toe edge, but the board hasn't moved. So you haven't used inclination and angulation to control tilt. But they're happening at the same time. Once you move that little bit further and you've got a little inclination or a little angulation and the board moves, yes, we are also controlling pressure across the width of the board, but you want your foundations to be clear so you're not mixing them up. And then that makes it really easy to talk about 2 or more fundamentals or 3 or 4 fundamentals when you understand how the movements are controlling both of those at the same time, but what the difference actually is. Then we finalize with our control of the board's torsional twist, torsional flex, the twist, using again flexion, extension, and rotation of the body. I keep it in this order for myself again, because I feel that when we talk about flexion extension, even way back at Cert 1, when we're talking about pedaling, right? It's the first way I can think of that we're creating oppositional movement of the legs to get twist the most efficient and effective way. Obviously, if I turn my hips and rotate my hips, I can also create oppositional movements of the legs and create twist. And again, this is where perhaps it gets very easy to blend it with pivot. But when you're showing your technical understanding, when you're showing your MA skills, we want to be able to relate the direct movements to each fundamental so we can prescribe a change to that fundamental. All right, so as we explore a little bit, I'm not moving too fast, right? Everyone wave if they're okay, good. I saw some shaking heads there. All right. I've got a timer going here to make sure I don't go too fast. Snowboard fundamentals, when we want to explore the interaction. And I've already started hitting upon this a little bit. We're already, addressing as we went through the fundamentals of our common errors of when we're doing that. So as we go through the next couple of still images, we want to make sure that we are, again, addressing each one separately so that we can acknowledge how the movements create them together. So if we look at our still image here, and obviously next week with clarification, I'll be getting some more video going. In practice and application, we'll definitely be using video. All right, so if I look at this right here, again, it's a little similar to our picture of Chris Rogers before, but this is on a toe side turn. And I'm going to hopefully show you some examples of how we can infer movement or perhaps describe what would happen next. So if I look at this rider, and again, I'm just, first of all, notice the position that the shoulders are turned and open. There's some rotational movement that's happened here. And so I'm going to focus on pivot and the movements that created that pivot right off the bat. So even in a still image, as I've typed up here, we can infer that the rider has rotated the upper body to initiate pivot for a heel side turn. I'm looking at this track of the snow, and I think it was already at the end of that toe side turn. She's done something to make the next turn happen. And so obviously we've got some rotational movement. We've got some pivot that might be starting to happen because that is the most direct movement that will help that pivot occur in the initiation of the turn. And it will also allow and enable the lower body to rotate through leg steering from the hip and flexion extension of the legs through the control and finish of that soon-to-be heel side turn. So again, I've described all the movements there. We can see how I'm talking about the legs, so a little common thread as we develop process. when we're talking about rotation and pivot and maybe some flexion and extension to control pivot with the lower body, it's really easy to talk about one leg or the other leg, but realistically, we want to talk about the lower body steering. So you want to talk about both legs doing something. Now, if I get into a little bit of prescription just on pivot, obviously this might be an inefficient use of pivot because we're turning the upper body, whereas perhaps we could have, kept that upper body a little more stable and used the lower body more. The lower body is directly connected to the snowboard. Perhaps that introduction of some flexion extension and some leg steering, some rotation of the lower body earlier would be a prescription of change that we could offer. Okay, so here we've just gone through that little one still image of how we can infer something happening with rotation, flexion extension to control some pivot. If we then go into, and I'm again doing this on purpose because obviously it's the most closely related one to pivot because it's the same exact movements. So if we explore a little bit, same still image of how this rider is controlling the board's torsional flex, the twist, using some flexion extension and rotation of the body. So the rider has flexed the hip, extended the knee, and the ankle of the front leg. Is the rider that has extended the hip, flexed the knee and ankle of the back leg, creating some oppositional movement and hence twist in the snowboard at the initiation of this heel side turn. The fact that they're on a toe side edge, I'm obviously describing when we get to the end, perhaps more of a skidded task. The edge change hasn't happened yet. All right, so the hips and the upper body have also rotated with this oppositional movement of the legs. Whether you say that the hips rotated to create the oppositional movement or because the legs moved, obviously that moves the hips as well. It's still describing how the body is moving. I'm describing specific body parts and where they're moving to. Okay, I could add in that reference alignment of how the rider is opening towards the nose of the snowboard and so moving past that reference alignment of shoulders and hips perpendicular to that front foot. So this will enable that rider to maintain this oppositional movement and then perhaps use flexion extension of the legs and rotation of the hips through the control and finish of the heel side turn. Obviously, the intensity of these movements do not create sufficient twist to be truly effective, and again may delay that skidded turn, that initiation of the skidded turn. It might be more effective, obviously, to be a little bit more using those lower leg levers, getting more active movement in the legs to get more effective and efficient twist in the snowboard. But again, hopefully this shows that we just described almost exactly the same movements that I described for pivot, but I've related the movements and how they affected the snowboard to a different fundamental. And I've done this deliberately separately because then if I was going to describe these two together, pretty easy to do that. But as you develop your process, you've got to develop your technical understanding so you don't start describing perhaps two at the same time or describing how the rotational movement creates pivot, but get sidetracked starting to talk about the twist instead. All right. And again, hopefully this is giving you an idea of how we can build up through our Cert 1, where we just talked about one fundamental. Now we're building up into two. So this would be Cert 2, two or more. And then if I go to the next slide, hey, I can bring in the third one. So control of relationship of the center of mass to the base of support to direct pressure along the length of the snowboard. The rider has flexed the hip, extended the knee, and ankle of the front leg. pretty close to exactly the same description I just gave on the other one. But as you can see, I've changed a little bit because now my focus is it made that front leg longer. And the rider has extended the hip, flexed the knee, flexed the ankle of the back leg, making it shorter. Again, talking about body-specific parts, how they're moving, where things are moving to. This moves the center of mass aft over the snowboard at the initiation of the heelside turn. This will enable the rider to flex the ankle and the knee of the front leg, extend the ankle and knee of the back leg, and move the center of mass forward over the snowboard through the control and finish of the heelside turn. However, in terms of my evaluation for later on prescription, this does make the after the snowboard, the tail of the snowboard heavier and delays the skidded turn, makes the duration of that turn longer. So hopefully you can see how I'm bringing in some dirt, but with one picture, I've described potential movements, body-specific parts, how they're moving, and how that changed what happened to the snowboard. And it's all in the same picture. So all of these things are happening. And hopefully you can see that this is a suggested way of building up that process to go through one or more fundamentals, two or more fundamentals, to three or more fundamentals. And this was a very easy way to blend in and describe three fundamentals with just one still picture. And as you're developing your process and practicing, if this is the way your brain works, embrace it. And, maybe even when you're practicing with some videos, pause it, see what position you're seeing, describe how it changes to the next position. And this might be some of what we explore a little bit with video in the clarification session next week. So, pretty much, I think what I just described here, we observed and evaluated 1, 2, and 3 fundamentals as they're all happening at the same time. We could continue with all 6 here, but I'm going to pick another picture in a little second or so, and we're going to describe through perhaps the other 3 as in another example. But obviously I can see and look at this picture here and start describing movements in the body that are creating some inclination or some angulation for tilt. Right? I could explain perhaps how the body is moving to bring pressure here at the point they're just finishing that toe side turn. They're starting the heel side turn. So there'll be definitely some movement towards the middle of the board to see, I almost went to tilt, to get the weight towards the middle of the board. And then when we change edge, to get pressure directed to the heel edge of the board. And I can definitely think about where that body is moving up and down, or whether the board is moving towards me. I could talk about pressure in terms of magnitude of interacting the snowboard with the snow surface. Okay, so as we describe these little next little picture here, and I've picked a couple of pictures. They almost look like they could be one after the other. They're not, but I made it look that way, so that we can maybe start thinking about how we can start thinking and looking at movements. And I've just gone on ahead here and put in all 3 that we're going to describe here. So we're going to start off thinking about control of the board's tilt with a combination of inclination and angulation. So in the control of this toe side turn, it's definitely after the initiation part, but we are going to just describe this little section here. The rider uses inclination of the upper body to get the board on edge. We can see that that whole body is leaning towards the toe edge, and that's the main use of this rider getting the board up onto edge. And in the finish, the rider is still using some inclination, is still inclined, but perhaps uses a little more angulation, using those legs, those shins, so that the upper body could reach for that heel edge grab. It's still quite a lot of inclination in there, right? But if we are not too worried about describing the big buzzwords, we want to really think about the movements that we can see from one picture to the other. The rider definitely is inclining with the body, but there is perhaps some bend in the ankles, knees, so there is some angulation, and that is controlling the tilt. Okay. Now, if we go to the control of the relationship of the center of mass to the base of support to direct pressure across the width of the snowboard. And again, I've put these two together because these are just like twist and pivot. These are the two that are perhaps most easily mixed up. Not confused, but just maybe we start talking about them both at the same time, or we talk about pressure creating tilt, or tilt creating pressure. They influence each other, but we want to think about how the movements affect and change both rather than how they too much influence each other. We wouldn't necessarily put more tilt to control the pressure. We would control the pressure with the tilt we want to have. Anyway, so the pressure across the width of the board, the rider has flexed ankles, knees, and hips in the control phase of this turn. And we are thinking about that that will move the center of mass towards, and in this case, if we're thinking about the turn, almost past the toe edge of the snowboard. Definitely is moving the weight, the pressure towards that toe edge. At the finish of the turn, the rider continues to flex the ankles, knees, and hips to keep the center of mass barely over the toe edge. It's over the toe edge. But again, because he's reaching for that grab, the rider would logically have flexed his knees a little bit more to bring that center of mass towards the middle of the board, because that's perhaps the only way he's going to reach that heel edge of the snowboard. But hopefully that does give us a little extent of how we can see the board is more on an edge. But if we look at that body position, I'm not entirely sure that the pressure across the width of the board has changed much. If you drew a line for a center of mass towards the snowboard, it would be quite similar in both of these pictures, even though the second picture, there is way more tilt. So hopefully that is a good example of how we can control pressure across the width of the board separately from tilt. Once the board is on edge, I can move my center of mass more towards my toes or more towards my heels, using flexion extension of my joints to move that center of mass. It doesn't have to move the board and change the tilt as well, unless I change the degree of inclination or angulation that I'm using. Okay. So we could prescribe opening the hips to bring the center of mass closer to the balls of the feet, maybe in the middle of that toe edge, and control more effective pressure on that toe edge. I think that would make it very hard for him to grab that heel edge, though. So for the task who he wants to perform, it's not always necessarily about the most effective or efficient. It's about what we want to perform. So then we move into the sixth fundamental, control of magnitude of pressure created through snowboard and surface interaction. The rider definitely moves closer to the snowboard from control to finish, controlling the magnitude of pressure to engage the edge. And obviously here we are thinking about the fact that, you know, he's reaching for the snowboard, he had to be closer, but perhaps we're describing here, if we were watching a video, more of a extending edge change movement pattern, because at the finish of the turn, he is smaller, he is closer, he is generating some engagement and some control of pressure with the snowboard in the snow by getting flexion in the ankles, knees, and hips. But this is where we may explore a little bit of these interrelations, as we just did with tilt and pressure across the width of the board. If we think about a carved turn, and that the carved turn on edge has a reduced surface area, reduced contact with the snow. And so pressure increases because of that. And so we would have to manage that pressure increase of the snowboard interacting with the snow surface. And again, the easiest way I think of remembering that is when you put air in your tire, it's PSI, pounds per square inch. So as soon as we think about, Tony here didn't suddenly gain weight during his turn. He didn't suddenly eat a sandwich halfway through the control phase and the finish of the turn. So the pressure change here is because in that second picture, he's on way more of an edge of the snowboard, standing on less of the snowboard. The square inch, the area has reduced. And so the pressure, his weight over that area has increased. And so again, interaction, that has changed. So I might need to prescribe, or the rider might need to move to control and manage that magnitude of pressure. And there we get that interaction and that process building up. It becomes almost a clear pathway about which ones would make sense to talk about. Okay. All right. So again, if we just detail that around, in this example, we can see how we showed the interaction between those three fundamentals. Now we've done in our two examples, all six fundamentals, showed a little bit about how they interact, but more importantly, hopefully showed how the movements of our body controls all six at the same time. And then as we develop our technical understanding, as we develop our own personal analysis, and as we develop our own movement analysis process, we want to be able to still describe those movements and those fundamentals separately so that I can tell a rider, or I can tell the assessor that the rider's doing this to control tilt. And then as they go up on more of an edge, we're also going to prescribe some more angulation to control the edge. And also at the same time, because we're moving that center of mass towards the toe edge of the snowboard by you bending the ankles and, in this case, bending the hips, we want to open those hips and we can prescribe a change in that pressure across the width of the board. Then we're at Cert 2 level. Blend in some other fundamentals, and all of a sudden we're at that Cert 2, that Cert 3 level because we're describing 3 or 4 or more fundamentals. All right. And again, there's a little bit of my example of how if you're standing on flat snow, you can move to stand on your toes and not have the heel edge leave the ground, or you feel it unweighted, but it's not moving the snowboard. That's pressure across the width of the snowboard, pressure to the toe edge, without necessarily the inclination or angulation to create tilt. So we're about 57 minutes. I'm just going to review that. As I said, we're going to be moving from this Master Talks presentation into next week. I'll be running the clarification. So I will obviously save a couple of minutes at the end of this to check the chat and make sure, see if we've got any questions that we might have come up from this little session. But anything else that we have, if you're coming to the next clarification session, and I hope you do, anything that we don't address there, feel free. That's a good time to ask clarification, because obviously I can explore it with video, with more time to actually delve into it. And then we'll be moving into the practice session with Lindsay, where we're obviously, this is a good chance to then get into teams and get into breakout rooms to really practice with these and develop your process. And then the application, perhaps, where we're bringing it into the actual use of that MA, that actual use of technical understanding in terms of application, whether it be for assessment or your own personal use. And then, as I said, there's 5 Tuesdays in July. So we have a multidiscipline wildcard presentation on the 29th with Mike Ma. So thank you all very, very much. And hope to see you next week.